So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are, if you're here in St. Louis or other parts of the world. Thanks for joining us. We have a few other lectures coming up. Just wanted to give a few notes about that. On Wednesday, February 24th at noon, we have Alex Krieger, and as part of the MUD, Masters in Urban Design lectures. On March 4th, March 1st, we have Zoller Lima, is one of our own faculty, giving a lecture on Lino Bobardi. And on March 4th, we have Amanda Williams lecturing with Giles Smith from Assemble. And so they're going to be lecturing together and having a discussion. So please tune into that. That one will be at noon, where Zoller will be at 6 p.m. and Alex Krieger also at noon. So keep a lookout and check out on the website for that. For this lecture, if you are interested in receiving AIA credits, CE, continuing education, CEUs, please put your name and AIA number into the chat, and I will go ahead and record that, and we'll get that sent in to everybody. So with that, Robert McCarter will be giving the intro to Ed Ford.
All right, thank you, Chandler. And you can put in your name into the AIA credit thing at any point during the lecture. We'll just collect all of them at the end with the other chats. But I think that if you want to ask Ed Ford a question at some point or at the end, if you could, I think those probably go into the questions and answer, Jonathan. I don't know, I see both options, or is that also?
Yeah, the Q&A would be best, but either way, technically. Mm-hmm.
So if you could put that into the Q&A. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ed Ford, who is an old friend and who will give the first of our faculty lectures for this spring semester, which I might say, of course, he's not actually at the moment a faculty, but he was before a faculty, and we very much hope to have him back soon. I'll explain where he's teaching right at the moment, but he was teaching here in the area of detail quite a short while ago. His lecture is titled Outside the Frame, Carlo Scarpa and Sverre Fehn. When discussing architecture as the art and craft of building, Ed Ford chooses his words very carefully. So the frame of the lecture title, outside of which the work of Carlo Scarpa and Sverre Fehn is said to fall, may be simultaneously the standardized frame of construction and the frame of history and critical attention. And I suspect it might be a bit of both. Ed Ford is a practitioner, an educator, and an author, most recognized for his canonical 2-volume compendium, The Details of Modern Architecture, Volume 1 in 1990 and Volume 2 in 1996. Which entails redrawn axonometric sections of critical junctures that can be said to continue in some ways the tradition of Auguste Choisy's studies of Roman construction, architectural construction that were published at the start of the 20th century. These remarkable drawings are paralleled by an incisive text that draws our attention to the tectonic culture embedded in these details. If Kenneth Frampton's Studies in Tectonic Culture of 1996 as well, may be said to present an alternate or other reading of architectural history as being comprised not of the formal concerns, or not so much of the formal concerns of the architectural historian, but of the poetics of construction and the matters of making, with which architecture as a métier is inextricably intertwined in practice. If that's true, then Ed Ford's 2 volumes may be said, of details may be said to be the owner's manuals of modern tectonics. And small wonder that Frampton stated of Ford's 2 volumes were an indispensable work for those involved in the tectonics of the discipline of architecture. Following these 2 studies, Ford published the book 5 Houses, 10 Details in 2009, which is an extended mediation of the place of detailing in architectural conception, centered on 5 designs for his own house in Charlottesville, Virginia. In 2011, Ford followed this with the architectural detail, a theoretical examination of the definition of detail that complements, I think, quite beautifully his practical examination of details in his first 2 volumes. Ed Ford graduated from Washington University with a Bachelor of Architecture in 1971 and a Master's of Architecture in 1972. He began his teaching career at the University of Kansas in 1979 and taught at the University of Virginia continuously from 1986 to 2018. And from 2000 forward was the Vincent and Eleanor Shea Professor of Architecture. He has also taught as the Pietro Beluschi Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Oregon, as the McDermott, I think, Visiting Professor at the University of Texas, Austin, which was last semester, and then currently as the Fay Jones Visiting Professor at the University of Arkansas. And again in 2019, and again in the not too distant future, we hope, here at Washington University in St. Louis. Among Ford's honors and awards are the 2 successive Graham Foundation grants he received for the 2 volumes of The Details of Modern Architecture, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Washington University, appointment as the Thomas Jefferson Visiting Professor at the University of Cambridge in the UK, artist in residence at the following places: Petrified Forest National Park, Grand Canyon National Park, Grand Basin National Park, Cape Cod National Seashore, and 2 appointments as fellow at the MacDowell Colony in Petersboro, New Hampshire. Ford has lectured at over 30 universities and institutions around the world, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Ed Ford this evening to lecture in our series. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Should I just start my screen share? Is this the...
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, is everybody seeing the title slide?
Yeah, go ahead and go full screen. Perfect.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be back in St. Louis again, even if I'm only in pixels. I followed as much as I could the lecture series last semester, and there seemed to be a sort of unofficial theme, perhaps, of the history of the immediate past. I think Chantel's lecture about Mangiarotti and Eric's lecture on Cert, and I guess it was Robert Kahn's lecture on Stirling. And I thought these 2 architects from the same eras, Carlo Scarpa and Sverre Fehn, might benefit from the same sort of examination from the short perspective of the times we live in. It would be easier to talk about what is different between Scarpa and Fehn than to talk about their similarities. It was a great deal more than the distance between Fehn's Oslo and Scarpa's Venice. Scarpa once told Fehn that he didn't think there was any culture worth looking at north of the Alps, which is a strange thing to say to Norway's leading architect, but Fehn didn't hold it against him, and they got on. What they had in common is the problems of the 2 buildings that you see in front of you. About the same time, they were charged with very similar commissions. It was to do a museum of historic artifacts or art within an historic context. The first is the building on the right, the Castelvecchio. It was a historic building that had a number of sort of unfortunate modern additions made to it that Scarpa had to deal with. The one on the left, Fehn's Hamar Museum in central Norway, was largely in ruin. So there's a lot of architecture, there's a lot of building involved in deciding what to keep, what to destroy, what to build anew, and how to go about doing that. And their strategy and their ideology was very much the same. It was about layers. It was not about the typical American preservationist strategy of building to what's called the period of relevance. Let's say if you're restoring Independence Hall, you build it, reconstruct it the way it was in 1776. Scarpa and Fehn were far more interested in the multiplicity of a building, to them, the best way to understand it is a bit like reading a book backwards. That as you peel away each layer, you would turn each page and it would show you what had gone before. And the intention was to show quite literally all the different strata, both horizontally and vertically, that made up a building. And in this, they had a very common way of going about handling the architecture. What's remarkable about these two buildings is that Scarpa and Fehn did the entire buildings. They did all the exhibits. They decided where each piece went. Of course, they worked with the directors and the curators. Very different from the typical modern American museum where they're almost like office buildings. Renzo Piano does the inside, and then the exhibit designers show up and there's changing exhibitions and so forth. These were permanent installations. For the most part, both museums are substantially the way their architects left them. But in this regard, that is in their attitude toward exhibit design, they were far more radical, far perhaps less respective of history. And this is what I mean by outside the frame, or perhaps in terms of off the pedestal, is they really thought the conventional way of portraying art or artifacts in a museum was just completely wrong. That is, inside a frame or on top of a pedestal. They thought these were both problematic in that they really separated the viewer from the object more than connecting them to it. And they wanted to literally to either, if they couldn't dispense with frames and pedestals, they wanted to radically rethink them and redesign them. So I'll return to this, but let's start with, well, this question, what's wrong with the frame? What's wrong with using a frame? Isn't that the way we show art? So let's begin the story in Venice at the Biennale. The year is 1964. Biennale has been going on since 1895, I think, every 2 years. In its heyday, if you won the grand prize at the Biennale, you were pretty much set. It meant you were going to be in the art history books somewhere, if not more. And the winner of the grand prize in 1964 was the American painter Robert Rauschenberg. He was only the third American to win the grand prize, and he was the youngest person to have won it up to that point. And historians agree then and now that this was a turning point in the history of modern art in general. In a simple way, it marked the kind of official canonization, you might say, of pop art. But according to this quote below from Leo Steinberg, writing at the time, and according to modern day art historians such as Hal Foster, this essentially marked the death of art as a picture inside of a frame. Now, in my house and in your house, there are probably lots of vertical planes hung on walls that have frames around them that have representations in the side, and perhaps they're paintings, perhaps they're photographs. It's a very normal thing to us. So it's difficult to understand how this could be, how they could have ended in 1964. But essentially, it marked not just the end of the frame, but the idea of representation. This is, again, what Steinberg had to say. Something happened in painting around 1950 in the work of Robert Rauschenberg. We can still hang pictures, that these pictures no longer simulate vertical fields, but opaque flatbed horizontals. The pictures of the last 15 to 20 years insist on a radically new orientation in which painted surface is no longer the analog of a visual experience. The work Rauschenberg was doing at the time were called combines. By this, he simply meant a combination of the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional. But according to Steinberg and Foster, this work marked the end of representation, particularly representation inside a frame. Well, again, what was wrong with frames that we should get rid of them? There seems to be a consensus, in fact, one that I think Fehn and Scarpa agreed with, that the frame had to go. So let's talk about what exactly was seen to be wrong with it. You could argue that the problem wasn't so much the frame itself, but the perspective that occurred inside of it. Frames had been around for a long time, but of course, it's significant that the mechanics of drawing a perspective were invented by an architect, Brunelleschi, and the first treatise on perspective was written 20 years later by another architect, Alberti. And what the perspective did was essentially to locate the viewpoint, not the real viewpoint you're seeing the painting, but the virtual viewpoint where you have to be, where the visitor, the viewer would have to be to see the painting in that regard. The image on the right is the way you construct a perspective using the projection method. If you're as old as I am, or as an old an architect as I am, you're quite familiar with this. I suspect I'm not the only member of this Zoom conference that sat in the basement of Gibbons Hall and watched Professor Bockhorst draw this with chalk. But essentially, hoping you can see my pointer here, you start with a plan, and your very first decision is to decide where you are looking at this from, which is the station point here. And then you project the lines of that building onto this point, which is the picture plane. This is the frame, which you're going to see. This happens to be a piece of furniture, but this is the result. But again, it's not like a building elevation or a plan. You are located at a particular place from which you see the frame. You see this image inside the frame. This is Durer's representation of this process. Here is the frame, and this represents the picture plane, is the difference between the real and the illusion. On one side is reality, on the other side is this image, this representation of something three-dimensional, which is not. Within 100 years of the invention of perspective, the proscenium theater came along, and it's pretty much the picture frame transferred into drama. This is the oldest one that survives. It is the Teatro Farnese in Parma, not far from Florence, obviously. Previous theaters, older theaters, the Greek theater had been a semicircle. The Shakespeare's Globe Theater was something like an octagon. But in the proscenium theater, you were looking through a frame. It was very much like the picture plane of a perspective. On one side was illusion, that is beyond the frame. On this side of the frame was reality. It's a concept called in theater design the fourth wall. You're looking inside a room, pretending that one of the walls of that room is invisible. So this was a different kind of framing. And again, it is one which precisely located the visitor, or rather the viewer, in terms of what they were, where they were located. And this is what museums became. This is the Accademia on the right. This is this great room where you have all these urban perspectives. They're mostly one-point perspectives. They show parts of Venice, but they show other cities, real and imaginary. But it's a series of windows. You're looking through frames at these representations of the world. And again, you are located precisely because of the 2-point. And this is essentially what a lot of museums became. They became prosceniums, frames around what you were seeing. This is the Museum of Natural History in New York. One of the museums that popularized this diorama idea that is very much a kind of petrified performance in which you look through a glass into a small space which you had both real artifacts and representational ones. This is a display case in the Native American section in which the display case is playing the same role as the frame. Real Indian, Native American artifacts put on mannequins. This is a quote from Fehn talking about just how depressing he found this type of display. Again, particularly in these cases, you can say they're not so much connecting the viewers to the object as setting them apart from it or separating them from it. Of course, there was always a lot or long before Rauschenberg at least, there was a kind of subversion of the frame, particularly in Cubism. This is a great quote from Gertrude Stein talking about Picasso and Braque, is illustrated here. With the creation of Cubism, the framing of life, the need that a picture exist in its frame, remain in its frame, was over. This, what looks like a picture framer, is actually painted on. It's a sort of Picasso joke. But throughout art, you'll see less the destruction of the picture plane and the frame so much as the subversion of it. Picasso and Braque, and I think in a way Rauschenberg, didn't really want it to go away. They simply wanted it to be there to rebel against. But in any case, there's a great body of literature in psychoanalysis and psychology and phenomenology about what Jacques Lacan calls the gaze. That is, when you're looking into a frame, there is an imaginary subconscious other looking back at you, that it's a two-way process, that the picture plane, the frame, is this kind of mirror. Lacan says that I see myself seeing myself, or I am photographed, or again, the image of a mirror is a popular one. I don't have the time to exactly explain Lacan's theory of this, and frankly, I don't really have the ability. But the way I understand it is best exemplified by the image on the left. This is from the Marx Brothers movie Duck Soup, and it appears to be Groucho Marx looking in a mirror to see himself. What it actually is Groucho is looking through a door where his brother Harpo is dressed just like Groucho and is mimicking his exact actions, so that he thinks he's looking in a mirror, or at least pretends he does. And again, it was a great joke to the Marx Brothers. To Lacan, of course, it was something, the idea of this person peering back, this other, was fearful, paranoid, and anxiety provoking. But either way, whether it was comedy or tragedy, there was a dislike, a sense that the frame was creating another world on the other side looking back at us, and that it was literally putting us in opposition to whatever was on the other side of the frame, not so much giving us an understanding of it. But again, just to return to, this is Hal Foster's take on Rauschenberg's destruction of the frame, destruction of the picture plane. And he says, it was a turn in early Rauschenberg combines from a vertical model of a picture as window to the horizontal model of a picture as text. This refers to another common modern observation about art, that art began in you might say, in places like ancient Greece, where art and science and religion were the same thing. And that the first statues were, of course, idols. A statue of Apollo wasn't a representation of Apollo, it was Apollo. Over time, the work of art first lost its spiritual significance. It retained what was called its aura long after that. That is, Michelangelo's David is still literally a venerated work of art, although it doesn't have necessarily any direct spiritual content. But with the advent of the photograph, movies, and particularly the digital age, art simply became information. It no longer had any precise objective value. This is, of course, something you wouldn't believe if you've ever had to pay for a Rauschenberg. But Rauschenberg's work was really not quite so, it was more representative than he let on. This particular piece is called Canyon. And like a lot of early Rauschenberg, it's actually a reference to a classical representation. So if it wasn't itself representative, it was an analog of one. This is the story of Zeus turning himself into this is Rembrandt's version, to kidnap the child Ganymede. And this is Rauschenberg's representation with the stuffed bird and this bag of God knows what representing Ganymede's derriere. But in any case, there was a deliberate, I think, reference back to the historical in this as well. I don't think they really wanted to quite dispose of the frame. But precisely at the same time and precisely at the same place, that is at the Venice Biennale, what was happening to the frame in art was happening to the pedestal in sculpture. That it was seen, the pedestal, the plinth, was seen as something that was best disposed of. Again, that was doing art more harm than good. This is a work by Anthony Caro displayed at the, I think the 62 Biennale. It's called Early One Morning. It has a bit of the traditional in it as well. And if it was set up correctly, you came into the room and saw this composition was a bit like a Malevich painting. And then as you walked around it to the side, you realized it was far more three-dimensional enterprise. But the idea was that it didn't have a base. In fact, would be rather ineffective if it did. And this was the start of a whole, or at least part of the start of Donald Judd, Richard Serra, and many others of baseless in the sense of no plinth sculpture. This is what Jack Burnham had to say about it in 1967. Steadily, the base has declined in its purpose, isolating one class of objects from all others, sculpture. The sculpture could be created by setting an object upon a base became a chief dialectical dilemma of modern sculpture. And what Burnham was saying is still essentially true. It had been proven in the 20s by the Dadists that if you took something and put it inside a picture frame, or if you took an object and put it on a pedestal, and you put both of them in an art gallery, you would have art. People might not like it. They might not agree that it's art, but they would treat it in that way. And in Burnham's view, this may have elevated those objects to artworks, but in the process, it really destroyed the pedestal, because once it could be put to such purposes, it became real. Make anything into art, it was useless. This is another exhibit at that same Biennale. I'm sorry, well, this is 1964. This is an exhibit by Giuseppe, and you can see it. There are some bases in the room, but it is very much working against both these ideas. Notice that most of the pieces are facing either partially away from us or directly away from us. There really isn't a point of view, certainly no frame, no specific point at which we see these pieces. And in fact, we are basically like they are bodies inhabiting the space. This is very much connected to, of course, what was going on with the idea of the base and with what Anthony Caro was doing. But this particular exhibit was designed by Carlo Scarpa. Scarpa worked at the Biennale for over 20 years. He basically set up the temporary exhibits in the Italian pavilion, of which this was one. And he probably had very little interest in somebody like Rauschenberg, although he was very interested. But he was very much of the same mind, that both the frame and the pedestal were doing the display of art or artifacts more harm than good. There's nothing particularly revolutionary about Scarpa's exhibit. This is a work by Giacometti. These, I don't know how big, these are less than a foot tall, but what Scarpa was doing was simply taking these large Giacometti pieces and placing them in a similar arrangement. That this is called plaza, interestingly enough. But he's setting these pieces up in the same way. But this is essentially, from Scarpa's point of view, is what they were trying to do. They were trying to take the sculpture off the pedestal, take it out of the frame, put it out where it could be almost treated like a person, or literally treated like a person, that you could confront it. It's not facing you, it is there for inviting you perhaps to come and engage with it. But again, this, as we'll see, it's not the last time I'll show the Scarpa slide, because I think it had very much to do with their way he set up, particularly parts of the Castelvecchio. Also at the 62 Biennale was the inauguration of this building. This is the Nordic Pavilion, designed by Sverre Fehn. Different countries have, I think there are about 20 different pavilions representing different nationalities. This one was built to represent all the Scandinavian countries. But Scarpa, or Fehn, was there obviously for the opening in 62, and it was there he met Scarpa. And it was a rather critical point. Scarpa had just finished the renovation of the Castelvecchio Museum in Verona, which is of course nearby. And Fehn was about to begin work on the Hamar Museum. And again, the programs and the contents of both these buildings had great similarities. So Fehn was, of course, younger, and Scarpa took him to the Castelvecchio and showed him what he was doing. And it was a profound experience for Fehn, because it really at least dictated the way he was going to approach the design of his own museum in Norway. But leaving the Biennale and talking a bit about Scarpa, I talk about detailing, and Scarpa, according to the internet, is at least a great detailer, but I'm going to talk about a different aspect of Scarpa. These are what we think of as Scarpa details, particularly the double circle. If you want to know about this, I recommend Robert's excellent book on Scarpa to you, but this is not the aspect of Scarpa I'm going to deal with. These kind of devices that are typically thought of as Scarpa details play a rather minimal role in the two Scarpa buildings I'm about to show you. Something that's I have to mention, because you're going to see it in virtually every slide, is the Scarpa, what I call strategy of doubling the structure. Every Scarpa column, at least in his mature work, is doubled, or if you like, separated and rejoined. You can see these two steel pipes with this brass connector. Wood beams are often, or steel beams as well, are often split and doubled. And again, it's a universal characteristic. It's much easier to describe than explain again. And I mentioned it because you're going to see it in virtually every slide, and you're going to, it may be present there, it may be critical, but it's hard to avoid. But was really critical to Scarpa in terms of his engagement with the Castelvecchio was the building culture of Venice. It was very much about layered construction, as was Scarpa's approach to renovation. The Roman palazzo, the Florentine palazzo, were thick walls, largely monolithic stone buildings. Not so the buildings of Venice. They're typically brick. They have this thin layer of either plaster or very often marble on the outside, what we would call a veneer, what Ruskin called incrustation, or if in this case the brick domes of St. Mark's are covered with mosaic tiles. Part of the reason for this layering was practical. Venice, of course, is built on a lagoon. All these buildings are on timber piles. Making a building more massive and more monolithic may make it weaker rather than stronger. But I think it's more than practicality. It was largely a question of building culture. Venice was very closely associated with Constantinople, with the Byzantine architecture in its early years, and it was the obvious transfer of this veneered style of building, which is very much associated with Byzantine architecture, to Venice. And again, unlike modern stone veneers, these weren't about stone masquerading as a thick rubble-like stone wall. They were, in fact, celebrated the veneered quality of this. This is the side elevation of San Marco, and you can see it's called book matching in sculpture. But again, it's quite clear that this is a veneer, and particularly the fasteners that are exposed. It's quite clear that this is this very light cladding, this thin layer of incrustation on the actual body of the building. Well, Scarpa, who was of course Venetian, literally turned this into a strategy for dealing with the past and the present. This is a classic example of Scarpa at work. This is the stairway in the Carini Stampalia Foundation. It was an old Istrian stone stairway that had been worn down so much it needed to be replaced. But rather than replacing it, Scarpa put simply another layer on top of the old stonework, that is straightening out the treads and risers, but not going so far as to cover up what had there before. And this, in a nutshell, is what Scarpa's attitude toward restoration was about. Revealing the old layers, not hiding them, but putting another layer on top. And if you look around Venice, certainly, you'll see this layering strategy very much in evidence. This is an Olivetti showroom, basically an office machine display store. This is in the Piazza San Marco. And it's layered in a series of ways. These stairs, of course, are one type of layer. But a different one is what happens along all the corners of the building. That is, all these veneered surfaces stop well short of its junction, so that you see the plaster panel here, the concrete behind it. Again, the terrazzo stops here, so that you see, in theory, the concrete floor underneath it. So again, it's literally delaminating the building to show you its layers. This is upstairs in the showroom. It is an old brick pier that was load bearing that had to remain in place, and Scarpa clad it with, again, thin layers of stone. But look at the way he does it. The corners aren't mitered, but again, the stone, the edge of the stone is left rough while the face is polished. And you get this stark contrast, this sort of pinwheeling effect. There's even a little hole there so the mason can reach in and complete the fastener that holds the veneer in place. But again, the point is he's celebrating, in fact, exploiting the quality of layering rather than trying to disguise it. This is back at the Carini Foundation, but you can again see these same strategies at work, particularly in these corners, again, where the various finished pieces don't quite meet up with each other. Water often gets in the gate here, so water constitutes yet another layer in this ensemble. But you can see the various strata here, both horizontally and vertically. Again, the book telling you the history of this place. This had an interesting effect when it got applied to the window. This is the Bank of Verona, and there's nothing historic in this building. It's a brand new construction from inside to out, but it shows you that Scarpa continued this layering strategy in the facade. And it resulted in a rather curious kind of window. There is a wall plane here that is constituted by this, well, what's really a concrete wall faced with brick and then with stucco. And they're rather, you might say, conventional window openings cut in this, frames if you like. But the glass is never set directly in the opening. Or not never, but for the most part, it sits in front of it, as it does here in this projecting bay, or it sits behind it as it does in this round one. And the window that is behind the round bay is actually square. This is looking out. So this is a different kind of framing, one that Scarpa was quite happy to take advantage of. But it's an interesting contrast to see the way he treats the real window versus the representative window that is the picture frame. I don't know for sure this is good grammar, but I'm going to call this modes of unframing and talk about the various strategies Scarpa used to both get rid of the frame and get rid of the pedestal. I don't know if Stephen Leet is part of the audience today, but if he's there, he's probably thinking, isn't it time to talk about Franco Albini? And he'd be right, it is time to talk about Albini. Scarpa was not alone in this exercise. He was part of a group of architects working in different firms who were reinventing the museum, particularly the Museum of Religious Art. This Albini on the right, this is a museum in Genoa. Again, not getting rid of the base, but certainly rethinking the base. This is a hydraulic lift that also rotates, that allows this. I believe this particular saint was somehow involved with flying through the air, and this is Albini's representation. And that happened. Didn't work for very long. It broke almost immediately. It's long dismantled, but it was an important point in this sort of rethinking of the base. This is a firm called BBPR. The P and the R, Parasudi and Rogers, I think, were the chief designers. This is a museum in Milan. It's the Forza Museum. It is no less important than the Castelvecchio. But you can see that both Albini and Rogers, I think in this case, were more aggressively modern. Hanging the crucifix on these two steel pipes would be a bit much even for Scarpa. But to talk about the milieu, if you will, in which Scarpa was working, and particularly this idea about art losing its aura or even its spirituality. All of these museums I'm talking about, all the ones in Italy, are for the most part places for art that had been in churches from the late Gothic, the early Renaissance period. And they, again, these pieces, despite it being the 15th century, still had this spiritual association because they were made to go in a church and to serve a spiritual purpose. This one still is. This is a famous Bellini. This church is in the central part of Venice. It's very close to a major pedestrian route. If you're in there, you'll see lots of art history students, but you'll also see people basically saying noonday prayer or stopping by, as it were. So Scarpa was very conscious, I think. He wasn't a religious person, but he's very sensitive to history. And he was very aware that this art wasn't just pieces of aesthetic pleasure wandering around, that it had a specific location and purpose from which it had been displaced, again, to be in a museum. This is another piece that's still in place, but it is, it's very telling because this Bellini, another Bellini, is very specific to its location. This is a church of San Zaccaria. I'm showing you the piece in place, but again, notice the vanishing point. This is my two pictures superimposed. I'm trying to show you the painting without the frame, but the vanishing point is very low, not quite eye level, but close to it, so that the visitor in the church is standing at precisely the right place. Notice this is a frame around the painting, a real frame, and that frame merges into the representational frame of the painting. So there's a very tight marriage between the virtual part of this painting and the real part, which is the frame on the outside. And this is not unusual in works in Venice. And you would assume that Scarpa, being sensitive to history in the way that he was, would have tried to display works of this, those works having been displaced to museums, that he would try to use them in the same way. But the fact is, for the most part, he did not do that. He rather saw them as objects that have been liberated, that in fact deserve to be set apart. We'll come back to that. If you're wondering what happened to the top part here, Napoleon loved this painting. He was transfixed when he saw it, and since he was running the world at the time, he had it shipped back to Paris so he could look at it every day. But when they tried to put it in his living room, they said, well, it's too tall. And they said, well, just chop off the top 5 feet. And hence the white strip at the top. At least most of the painting found its way back to Venice, where it is today. This is a Scarpa installation. This is actually in the Castelvecchio. This is an instance of, according to the museum director, Scarpa was trying to simulate the effect of an altarpiece. That is, it's very common in the altars or the apses of Italian churches to see these paintings, for example, hung at this height, which is a rather unnatural way to see them. But again, this sort of arrangement is rare. That is, he rarely tried to exactly replicate the kind of conditions in which this art was displayed. He was far more interested, as you see it here, in letting these pieces take on their own autonomy. You can tell a bit about Scarpa from this. He didn't just dislike the frame, which is hard to avoid in painting. He didn't like the frame on the wall. And if he had to hang it on a wall, he wouldn't put it on one of the main load-bearing parts of the wall. He would put it often in a freestanding partition in that was set in the middle. This is another exhibit from the Biennale, but it actually was, the walls here are covered up with these scrims, these fabrics, and the paintings were either freestanding, as this one is here, or put on these partitions in a deliberately rotated movement. I think in a way, this was Scarpa's preferred way of presenting art, as almost as an isolated piece, as if it were a person in and of itself. Hanging was a solution to this. This is another moment in the Castelvecchio. This allowed, again, these pieces to literally float in space. This was a proposal, again, for the Biennale, in which all of the painting in the space would be suspended from the roof. But there are obviously practical problems with doing this throughout. This, I think, was the arrangement that Scarpa really preferred, particularly the one right here, which is simply that the painting is liberated from its environment. It's put on this easel at eye level, so it becomes literally a person in itself, very much like the Giacominni's I was showing you. Often he will put these facing away from the door so that you have to walk around the front to see the piece of it. This is another arrangement again, the freestanding painting as an object within the room. This is, it's called a cavaletto in Italian. It's a Scarpa piece of furniture well worth looking at. And you can see all his devices at work here. Again, the structural doubling, the little brass fasteners holding it all together. And again, it's a little kind of miniature Scarpa building. But what he really loved about these is they had really an anthropomorphic quality, so that the painting became a freestanding person in itself. This was another strategy, which to make this entire partition a frame. This is a Madonna, of course. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my pointer. In any case, there really isn't a frame here. There's just a piece of something like plasterboard that's had a hole cut in it, and the painting is put behind it, so that this whole panel becomes the frame. And the painting, rather than projecting from the wall, is recessed. There is a glass pane in front of the painting and a wood background behind it. But again, this is another type of layering in which he reverses the traditional arrangement of painting a wall to make the wall into the frame. This is an extreme version of that, in which there's actually a glass void in the partition in which the painting floats. This was an experiment I don't think he tried more than once, but there's again a glass layer in front of that as well. But essentially, again, the painting is not on the wall. It's not on even a sub-wall. It's out freestanding in the room. This is one of Scarpa's ways of dealing with sculpture, but three things about this piece. When you first see it not frontally. You don't see it face on. You see it from the side. And this is, I think, one way of avoiding this confrontation with the frame. There is a background behind the work that is meant to be seen against, but the piece is rarely, if ever, tacked onto that is supported by the background. The background is typically physically independent, although working visually to give this green background. Notice the straight up and down quality of the support. And again, this is very much at eye level. So again, if anthropomorphic, if you will, sense of this piece. This is a fairly early Scarpa piece. This kind of direct support, particularly when working with something like a sculptural support, is rare. He really preferred, he always showed you how it was supported, but he typically would take the load away in an indirect way. This is far more typical of Scarpa. This piece of this, I guess, a bishop kneeling. It is supported by the stone piece, which is on the steel piece. But again, Scarpa takes the load back before he brings it down. And he doesn't, it's braced against the wall, but it's not connected. The load doesn't go to the wall. This is far more closer to the mature Scarpa. That is this, show you where the weight goes, but you take it in an indirect way. Scarpa used glass display spaces. They're hard to avoid. This is one of his better known sculpture museums in Passagno. I think for the most part, the display methods there are not really that exceptional. This is an interesting piece in that it, well, for one thing, it replicates the glazing of the sort of inset glass corners that light the space. But notice what he thinks he does. You can make out my drawing of this. There is a frame at the base and there's a frame at the corner, but there's no frame across the top. This was just to avoid making a frame, to avoid making this rectangle you just see the piece through. But I'm going to show you parts of this gallery, which is deservedly one of his better known works. But this is the Palazzo Abatellis. It's in Sicily, in Palermo. Like all these museums, it's most of the art in there is either religious subjects taken from churches or portraits taken from the noble families. This was a traditional Italian courtyard building. It was bombed in 1943, and the facade that you see here was destroyed. And Scarpa rebuilt this wall. He salvaged what were the windows of the old palazzo and put them back, I believe, in their original place. But again, he didn't want this to appear to be a historic facade. He wanted to make it clear that this was a modern reproduction. So his methodology, again, was this layering system. He peeled back, or rather did not complete the plastering around the place. So it's always set off, but what's really concrete masonry here, so that you're seeing the new structural layer and the new plaster layer with the old genuine artifact behind. In a way, he's putting these on display in exactly the same way he displayed the blue Madonna in the other piece, which is inside. This was the largest painting he had to put inside. I think one of those architects who created a problem for himself to solve. He put the painting in a room that is just a hair too small to contain it, which gave him an excuse to cut out these notches on either side of the painting. So the painting really isn't the fourth wall of the room. It's literally appears to be a floating plane, although it obviously terminates the view in the space. I've already showed you parts of this, but again, this goes back to this triple strategy, again, providing a background, but not attaching the art piece to it, although that does happen in this case. And then again, allowing the piece to be far more freestanding than it would have been in its original location. And again, presenting it to you in an indirect way. This shows one of these pieces, not precisely the same one in what would have been its original type of context, hard up against a wall on something like a classical a column. As I said, I don't, as far as I know, Scarpa certainly knew Rauschenberg, or knew of him because he was at the Biennale. He was, and I suspect he had very little interest in him. But Scarpa was very involved with modern abstract art. And when I look at this piece, I can't help but think of Mark Rothko. In any case, back to this, I've already talked about the central piece here, this Madonna in the giant frame. This is an interesting room. It's got, there are no paintings on the walls. There is this freestanding partition that's set at an angle. It has rather prominent joints in it. That is a rather visible material. It's not white, anonymous stuff. And there are several paintings which are hung from it in interesting ways. In a way, these pieces are in the correct relationship. This is a Madonna, and these three are saints. This is back to this Bellini painting. This is what's called a sacred conversation in Italian Renaissance art, where you have the Madonna and the place of importance and the saints off to the side. Again, the saints are here in their subordinate role. There's another Madonna child back here, which has a pretty interesting framing methodology we'll come back to. These are these side pieces, and they are in this kind of enclosure, oversized frame enclosure, again, that they are, the painting itself is actually behind the white plane. These are not literally hung on the wall. The wall is angled, and each of these elements is hung on one side from a steel rod, so that this is literally rotated out into the space, so it's not flat against the wall. This, again, Scarpa always showed you how things were connected, but having done that, he would often take the load away in an indirect way. But again, I think this is a desire to take, which is a very, very frontal painting, and give it a sort of autonomy within the room. This is a fascinating one. Again, I think probably 9 out of 10 designers given the task of putting this painting on this wall would say, okay, well, we'll put it right here or right here in between these joints. Scarpa loved to do this. He loved to put the painting right on the joint between two elements. In fact, he loved creating a joint to put the painting on. But what this allows him to do is work out these, this is Scarpa at his best, these kind of details where he shows you, this is the joint that holds the panels together. These are the little dowels that hold the two sides of the wall together. And then this is the element that holds the painting in place. Here's a detail of those again. But again, this brings us to the Castelvecchio. It has a difficult history. This is the city of Verona. There's a map of the city of Verona. This is the river Adige. It's a fortified city. It's had various walls over the years. This is the medieval wall. And the Castelvecchio is located right here. It was a fortified palace with the Scaglieri family that ruled over the city, much as the Medicis ruled over Florence, much as the Sforzas ruled over Milan. They were susceptible to attack from the south, from other city-states, and from the city, from their own perhaps unhappy inhabitants. But again, it sits on the river and there's bisected by a bridge. But this is the way the plan of the assembly until about 1800. This is the building where Scarpa's museum is located, but that was not there. It's not part of the medieval building. In the Napoleonic era, the threat changed to the north and they built a wall on what had otherwise been open. And then the Austrians, who occupied Italy in the early 19th century, built this rather uninteresting barracks there. The old barracks museum became a museum in the 1920s. And it was a pretty cheesy affair. It was very much an ersatz Venetian palazzo. The inside had fake fireplaces and fake beams. The outside was redone with fragments of a Venetian palazzo. Again, this is a real Venetian palazzo. These are fragments of one worked into this wall in a way I'm sure Scarpa found repellent. So if you were doing a historic renovation of this building, there would be, in Scarpa's mind, a good argument for just getting rid of this part of the building, because this is, again, this is real medieval architecture. This is the fake medieval architecture. But because it was the museum, Scarpa really couldn't dispense with it altogether. So he tried a couple of things. He really originally wanted to get rid of these fake, to cut off the top of this wall to distinguish it from the real medieval parts behind, but he wasn't. Museum director wouldn't let him do that. What he did do is basically delaminate the building. He divided it, as he had done elsewhere, in the series of layers, adding some of his own and revealing some of the old. He also cut them away, cut the new false layers away from the old real ones. Right here, where this new wall touches the old, and right here, where again the fake new wall touches the real old wall. It's literally cut away to form a window. The other window is this famous shot you see of the Ca Grande statue. And again, you can see the window on the other side. But you can see him delaminating and peeling away the layers to tell you the story of this building, in a sense. That notice that the plaster stops here, the stone stops here, showing you the steel frame. That the tile stops here, then the layer of the copper continues, and then finally all of the beam continues over to the old wall. And again, this is not really, this copper roof does not extend all the way under the tile. It's a symbolic layering at best. But this layering strategy continues. Again, it sets it up as you enter the museum. Scarpa thought of the floor of this museum, he described them as pools of water. And he literally sets up this metaphor, these floating floor slabs here before you enter the museum. And of course, it's layered on the inside in this traditional way. The actual glass is pulled way back from the actual opening. So you get, again, this layered window that we've already seen. And of course, it's by now familiar Scarpa details where everything is stopped just short of where it would meet the next layer. Notice that these stone slabs occur only on the side of the opening, they don't wrap around. This little piece is called the cicello. It actually sticks out of the building right here. It's interesting to see how these parts are supported. Again, they not literally hung on the wall. There are a series of steel frames, and there is a series of steel angles that are wrapped around the edges of the building, and all of these connectors are welded to them. And again, this indirect support, this one is hung, and again, this is the strange sort of tripod of effects holding up this glass case. Again, you can see these, again, it's always doubled structural pieces. Of course, the key piece of delamination here is this rather structurally strange but visually compelling steel beam that's holding up this concrete floor. And they're only connected at one point. You can see the end of the steel beam here. Again, for the most part, the steel beam is separated out from the concrete, but it supports it at midspan, which is a good place, of course, to support it right here with this small pivot. Scarpa had the advantage that in this part of the museum, the museum was divided in the sculpture gallery and the painting gallery, which seems a bit pedantic, but it gave him the opportunity to put the sculptures in these spaces where there was literally nothing on the walls. Now, the typical sculptures he was showing are very much like these. They're carved all the way around, but they're made to be seen frontally. This is another church in Verona, and these pieces are still in place. But again, these pieces are, well, they're carved are rather uninteresting from the back, and you can't tell much about them. But it's interesting to see what Scarpa did in terms of studies up. He worked around the museum for a long time, and this was the first arrangement that was set up in the 1950s. And you're entering the room where this photograph is taken, and none of these pieces are facing you. They are facing away from you. In fact, they're facing the window so that they catch the light. I think there was about lighting, but it was also about this sort of avoiding the confrontation again. He much preferred that you see a sculpture first, either from the back or from the side, and then you had the choice really to discover it by walking around it. Over the years, he modified that. He put these all on these floating bases, which is very much a part of this kind of floor as water metaphor. But notice what he did. He got rid of this one, which was frontal. He replaced it with another one that's looking away from you. You see these two to the side, but he took this one and he turned it around so you're seeing it, the back of it first. So again, it's another piece where you have to walk around and discover it. This, I think, is where this Giacometti exhibit comes in, because he was working on this simultaneously as he was setting up the sculptures with in the Castelvecchio. And it was using the same approach. Again, you see this, the first Giacometti you see is back to you, and the others are in profile. It's only the last one that is facing you, and it's only the last one here that does that as well. So Scarpa was taking these, he wasn't putting these back in their traditional context. He was sort of setting them free, as it were, and treating them, again, very much like people. This is a crucifix in the next room. Again, this was his original context. He took these two pieces out of context and moved them well out of the room, and to much criticism, he added another piece. This guy is obviously looking the wrong way. He's looking at the visitor passing rather than looking up at Christ. But again, this is a Scarpa, one of these exhibit stands that he was so fond of. And again, that moves it out of its frame into the space. This is a curious one. It's he liked to put these up at eye level. And I have to tell you that these are actually the entries to the bathrooms. You have to walk around the edges here. So this is in the center part of the museum. But there's a very interesting set of pieces here. Again, he's using this indirect support. He's using the technique he uses elsewhere of always fastening the steel to the steel. But look at the difference between these two frames. This one is the one under this one. Richard Murphy says that this Madonna is missing her hand, and that this represents the missing hand. I have a slightly different interpretation. This Madonna is in contrapposto, that is this classical Greek pose where the weight is on one leg. The other Madonna, which is considerably heavier, both her and the Christ quite a few more pounds, but it's a far more direct load. And again, without the contrapposto, has this slightly different arrangement. Again, this is the last piece, the last room. Again, at this place there is a pedestal, but the sculpture's at eye level. But this brings you to the Ca' Grande. This is, again, the centerpiece of the museum. This one was put in its original location. That is, it was meant to be, this was the Scagliere family, and Scala in Old Italian means ladder. And this was their symbol, so their tombs, this is elsewhere in Verona. This was where this statue was originally located. So what Scarpa is doing is your first exposure to the statue is from the way you would have seen it in its original location. As you move through the museum, you actually come back this way, you see it more directly. But again, here it is at this point, as you move back through the museum this way, you see it in a different light. These are very interesting rooms over here. They weren't very often, they weren't very much changed because they were genuine medieval works. But this is one of the more interesting ones. And Scarpa's doing here with these easels what he had done with the sculptures in the room. He's really personifying these paintings. They're hung at eye level. They are freestanding within the room. They're not hung on a wall. And again, as you see here, when you enter the room, two of them are facing away from you, and one of them is slightly angled to the view you're seeing. But again, well, this I would say is really the point of this lecture, that this strategy, which is certainly present in the Giacomettis, a far more modern view, one where there's no framing, where there's no confrontation, where there's no axial picture plane or station point, is the same strategy used to arrange the sculptures here, and the same one he used to arrange the paintings here. The picture gallery, which is on top of this, is less interesting. Originally, these were, Scarpa actually closed up the center doors and opened up the edges so that you had this almost freestanding set of partitions. This is looking along that wall. And again, he didn't really want to hang paintings on this, but over time they've been put there. I'll end with one last, in the Scarpa part, with one last Scarpa frame. He was building this gateway to the University of Venice School of Architecture, and in the process they discovered an old classical portal, and a lot of people said, well, let's make this the gate to the architecture school. Scarpa incorporated it into the work, but he didn't want to use it as the doorway. He put it horizontally, perhaps having read Hal Foster about the horizontal nature of modern art, but he made it far more of an artifact and didn't use it as an entry. This is, again, back to Albini, but Albini was far more willing to do this, interestingly enough. Again, using these freestanding portals, moved there from elsewhere, and this is the Sforza Museum. But again, Sverre Fehn. Fehn, like Scarpa, saw the world in layers. He was far more interested in horizontal layers than he was in vertical ones. And it had to do with his particular view of his home country. This is, Fehn could be enigmatic, and never more so than he was making drawings. But what you see here is this is the sun, this is the earth, and this is a boat that's been buried in the earth, and this is a viewer standing above it looking into it. And this is a quite real thing. One of the most, probably the work of art, other than Munch's Scream, that the Norwegians are most proud of, are these Viking ships. They survived because they were buried. They were burial vessels, very much like an Egyptian funeral ship. But in any case, they were dug up about the turn of the 20th century, and they occupy this museum in Oslo again. Right next to that is the Norwegian Folk Museum, and the typical Norwegian wood building was usually elevated above ground, usually for practical reasons, but this is Fehn's two views of the world, the excavated and the elevated. And he saw architecture as existing very much between these two realms. And the museums he designed, most of which weren't built, followed this same protocol. This is an excavated museum. This is the Vasa Museum. It was a competition design that he lost. Vasa was a wood ship that was from the 18th century that was rescued from the muck of the Stockholm harbor and put in a museum. And Fehn's idea was to rebury it, basically. This is the main museum. This is the top of Fehn's museum there, which you really couldn't see except for the skyline. Again, he wanted to put it back in the ground in this excavated museum. This was a later competition. This was an old mining town in Norway. And this would seem to be the obvious program and location to have an excavated museum. Here he chose to do the opposite. That is, he made a bridge. His museum floats in the air. It touches the ground only at 2 points. But again, this is Fehn talking about the magic of history, the excavated artifact. And as we'll see, this is very much about what the Hamar Museum was about. This is his drawing of those three museums. This is the underground Vasa Museum. This is the floating bridge museum. This is the Hamar Museum, which what you're seeing here is a ruin. These are the ruined walls. These are the archaeological excavation. And these are these two bridges that float above it. But again, Fehn's ideas about framing. He took Scarpa's work as a point of departure, but you can see two varieties of it here. This piece is supported by a steel plate here connected to this steel plate, which is then bolted to the wall. It's not in a glass case, there's a plane of glass in front of it that rather than framing it, simply defines it. This is a somewhat scary quote from Scarpa about imagining yourself with a battle axe. This is not a battle axe, of course, it's a carpenter's axe. But again, this is probably the key thought that, again, frames and pedestals for Fehn and for Scarpa separated the viewer from the object. And they were both looking for a sort of empathy, if you will, between the viewed object and the viewer, something that things like frames and pedestals discouraged. But again, a bit about the history of Hamar. It was a cathedral. The cathedral by the 20th century was largely in ruins. There had been a bishop's house back here, which is what these black lines represent. It was almost completely in ruins at the time Fehn undertook the museum. It had had a barn built on top of it in the 19th century. And the most that remained was just the foundations and a bit of the wall here. So there were three very distinct historic parts of this building. The old bishop's palace, which is the same age as the church, and this barn on the outside. This was in ruins. Again, the walls were there, but the roof was deteriorating or gone by the time Fehn took it over. This is not the Fehn project. This is what encloses the old ruin of the church. This was done by Lund and Slato. It is actually a very nice building, but it's a very different approach than what Fehn would take. That is the sort of gigantic glass display case. This is Fehn's building. Again, he basically it is rebuilt from the top of the stone hall, and of course he did a lot of work stabilizing and preserving and restoring the stone wall. See the layering already in this case is using effectively reversing what Scarpa had done. He puts the glass on the outside rather than the inside, and lets the ruinous state of the wall exist. Again, the museum has distinct parts. You can see a bit more of this glazing here. this is the auditorium. This was a museum of, you might call it a folk art museum, basically tools of day-to-day life. This is what was the oldest part. This is where the remains, these walls were at least in part the remains of the older building, which is the palace. Most of the ruins of that are out there in the courtyard. This had no floor. In fact, it had no conditioned space. It's open only in the summer. These big glass planes aren't sealing anything off. And it really just had this single bridge across and what I call the chapels, these three little concrete squares in which have a small number of artifacts. What is really almost shocking about this arrangement is this ramp, which I'll come back to. But again, this is this glazing. This is actually a detail borrowed from Sigurd Leverance. And again, these aren't really windows, they're really just glass coverings. But again, adding a new layer to the old. This is the entry. But again, this is the most striking part of the complex. The new part of the complex is this huge floating concrete ramp. And again, this is part of Fehn's tripartite world, the elevated world above the ground, the excavated world below. And this architecture was very much about ramps completing them. But it's a strange journey. You enter into this really non-conditioned space and then immediately exit it into this ramp, which then takes you up to the top part of the auditorium, and then where you descend down into the auditorium proper. Again, this is the beginning right here. This is the top. This is, again, these models, these ramp models, which I think tell you a lot about the way Fehn saw the space that takes you up to the top of the auditorium. But you can see right here what Fehn is doing. He's imitating, not precisely, but figuratively, the shape of the old wall of the bishop's palace. This quote, I think, has to do with it. This ramp got a lot of criticism. It was called brutal and aggressive. And Fehn, again, who seemed to be receptive to criticism, yes, it is brutal and aggressive in the sense that he said it helped you reconstruct the building in your imagination. Again, here's the auditorium. Again, this is the curious part, or the most interesting part. Again, this is this floating little chapels. And of course, this was the part of the building that had religious connotations. That is and what artifacts or what objects they have that have a religious nature are placed in here in these skylit chapels. This is the floor you can walk on, and this is the elevated platform. This is the entry to one of these little cubes, again, which receives skylight from these glass tiles in the roof. This particular one is where this Madonna and Child is located, again, with this non-framing frame. All of the elements in here, they're given a sort of a religious association in terms of where they're located. There's a crucifix up here. There's the Madonna around here. On the outside of this piece, this is a sort of gargoyles. This is a demon, so the demons are on the outside and the saints are on the inside. But again, this is this type of support that Fehn, I think, learned from Scarpa, using it vertically rather than horizontally. This is a wonderful piece. These are two, again, pieces with religious connotations, a very, very delicate crucifix, and this large stone, which has these carvings on the side that have I'm not sure what they represent, but I think it's part of a depiction of a saint. Again, put on this, that is set in opposition to each other on top of this stone base. But again, the most real building-like part of the complex is this ethnographic museum. Notice it has 3 layers. It has the outer stone wall. It has this inner wood frame, which is all new. And then it has this concrete set of ramps and stairs on the inside. Again, you can see a good view of it in here, the sort of independence of the layers here. Again, like Scarpa, Fehn is using these horizontal and vertical layers to lay out the book, turning the leaves of the page that is the history of this building. You can see them quite clearly here: stone wall, wood frame, concrete inset. Again, some more of these vertical steel pieces sort of clamped down on the parts they're exhibiting. But again, I think this idea of empathy and the true art history sense of the word is very much the way to understand these. Fehn's biography said, this is a plow, of course, and the plow is literally plowing up the steel plate on which it's set. This is a scythe, of course, but it's set in this frame to give you the sense of the piece moving. Again, this is what the advantage that removing the frame and the pedestal gave him, is to demonstrate the sort of inner character of these pieces. Fehn liked glass cases, and he used them elsewhere to great effect. This is a photographic museum done after Hamar and a glass display case done before. They really evaded, or at least avoided, the rectilinear frame nature of these things in the museum, either by using a single sheet of glass, as he did here, or by building a non-rectilinear case, as he does here. He liked to put these in the windows so that they caught the light. This is something that tells you a lot about the difference between Scarpa and Fehn. There's very much a Scarpa style of building. If you walk around Venice or Verona, you can spot Scarpa buildings or buildings by Scarpa because they have double circles or the typical Scarpa motifs. For Fehn certainly had his bag of tricks, but he was far more of a each commission was a new departure. This is a building he added on to the Hamar Museum, probably 15, 20 years after its completion. They discovered some new ruins that had to be covered up, and he built this new shelter to go on top of them. But it has, you would never guess that this was the same architect of the old museum, because this was a different problem. There were no walls to use. He used this heavy timber affair. I think his intent was to make this light on the outside and heavy on the inside. But if I am an expert on detailing, I would say this: I find Fehn a far more interesting detailer than I find Scarpa. It is not about motifs or geometric form. It's about using your problem-solving capacity to elevate a joint or a connection into something more than its purely technical necessity. So again, I'll say goodbye to Carlo and his double circles. I know I'm running over a bit, but just let me say a few things about the relevance of all this. I think the lessons of Scarpa and Fehn have been largely disregarded. And I'll show two examples in the town in which I live, Charlottesville, as examples of it. One is this idea that restoration is about layering rather than making things new. This is a project, I'm not sure of its status. It was to restore the columns of Jefferson's Lawn. And these were brick pieces. They were covered with plaster, with cement, and then covered eventually with white paint. For all the years I was there, they looked like this. And you, in a subtle way, you see the various layers that made them up. And you actually see the works of architecture in which you could see the trace of the hand or the trace of the tool have an embodied history. And the tool wielders in this case, some of them were free white people, some of them were freed blacks. Some of them were black slaves. And again, their history is literally written in the various layers that made up this old column. Granted, it wasn't particularly, it looks more like a milk bottle than a Tuscan column, perhaps. It has been repaired and patched many times. But to me, I don't equate perfection with beauty or even good craft. And this was the new version. I don't know how many times this has been done. It makes, this is again the American system of preservation, is you eradicate the layers, you leave them behind, you cover it over with something new, and you restore it to its position of relevance by making it all shiny as if it was just finished the day before, and in fact was. Again, a view of the layered lawn versus the new potential unlayered one. And of course, pedestals in my part of the world are very much in the news and very much in use. This statue is about 4 blocks from where I am. This one is in Richmond, an hour away. These are both statues of Robert E. Lee. I think any sculptor looking at this today or at the time it was built would say, well, it's way too big. It's just very to make this gigantic pile of stone to support this rather small man and is not that large horse. But of course, this was necessary at the time. I think it was built around the 1900, maybe earlier, but it was necessary to give Robert E. Lee the gravitas he deserved as being this kind of kindly father figure. Once the impression of Lee changed to traitorous slave owner, people felt differently about this. And these are part of the demonstrations following the death of George Floyd. And while the statue came under attack, so did the pedestal. In fact, it received more. It was this greatly over-designed pedestal that, as Burnham was saying, was giving authority to this rather disreputable figure that was occupying it. So it was under attack daily with spray paint and nightly with strobe lights. It is still there. This one is again nearby. I've walked by it for years. It is caused this pain, death, and injury. In fact, the idea of removing it is what provoked the riots in August of 2017. Before the violence and the death, there were a bit more measured conversations that went on about what to do about it. And one of the more interesting ones came, preservationists who had no great love of Robert E. Lee, but wanted to save the historic artifact, was that the problem isn't Lee, the problem is the pedestal. The pedestal is giving this person, this statue, our endorsement. And why don't we keep the statue but get rid of the pedestal? That idea has gone by the board. But again, despite the efforts of the art world and Fehn and Scarpa, the pedestal is still very much with us. Sorry I've gone long, but I am done. Robert, are you out there?
Joining, yes.
Okay, I'll turn off my screen.
We'll let Jonathan figure out who sees what, but yes, go on so we could have some questions. I have been checking the question and answer, and I haven't seen anything yet, though there were a couple of things dropped into the chat. There were just some questions from one of the students about knowing the names of a number of the pieces that you were cycling through, and I think I would suggest the best way to deal with that would be that this is being recorded, and it will, maybe in a week or two, it will appear on the lecture list, and one can actually have a look at it again and take down the notes of all these.
I could supply something with no great effort, I think.
So, because I know that you were not only jumping around in time and space, but also in some in Scarpa's own work, which I know very well. But I had a couple of questions. I thought that I liked the fact that there are lessons to be learned from Scarpa and Fehn. They are different from each other, and I would argue that you can't take Fehn out of Norway and you can't take Scarpa out of Venice. So it is not easy to try to compare them sort of apples to apples. And that's part of the reason that they have such respect for the history, and they treat it perhaps in an unexpected way, but with a kind of freshness. And I thought the example from the Jefferson lawn is just perfect, because that is so true. And what we do in America, and unfortunately the rest of the world now follows America in terms of how historic preservation is defined, more often than not, we put it in a formally pure state, which means we erase all sense of its being a made historical artifact, and any kinds of being a record of those who both made it, like you said, but also those who patched it, and those who may have run into it with their bicycles in the case of the, or whatever has happened. I mean,
drunken undergraduates.
It's now been completely, it's an undergraduate dorm. So it's now been completely erased, and it's the same feeling. I was at the Scarpa Bank in 2000, and I don't remember if it's 4 or 8, but anyway, they had renovated the bank. And I had been to the bank first while it was still in construction in the 70s. And I was out front with the president of the bank looking at the front of the Banco Popolare di Verona. And they had completely cleaned it, and all of those beautiful drip marks that Scarpa carefully designed, because he designed these little drips under all those windows you were describing. So the water goes into those recesses and it comes back out through these drips, and it sort of course, it stains slightly the plaster, which is actually very much designed to be stained, because it responds to some of the things in the air. And he was very proudly showing me this. And I was thinking, Scarpa is just rolling over in his grave, because it looked brand new. And this is, it is a huge problem. And I'm sure it is also with Fehn in terms of if it needs to be preserved, how do we respect it in the way that he respected the work? And I guess there's one thing you touched on, which I think is interesting to sort of revisit, which is, or two things. One is that in the stairs at the Queen Stampalia that you showed that diagram, which I don't think is your diagram. I think that might be Richard's diagram. Yeah, Richard Weston. But I've taken Richard to task for that diagram, because the diagram actually just shows the old stairs and the new stairs just landing on top of them. And that's done. But the fact is, if you've been there, you know that in fact, the new stairs, to put the new stairs on, they cut holes in the old stairs and inserted the new pieces. So the whole nosing, the only pieces of nosing are left are the little piece in the middle and the two at the end. The nosing is cut out to allow the flat piece to be set in. So that in fact, if you were to take it off, this is what I think makes Scarpa so interesting, is if you were to take it off, it's scarred. It really can't be used. It's actually ruined. So now he's fused the new with the old in a way that you cannot really take them apart again. It's not, and that all of the other skins that you showed of Scarpa are the same. They're attached in a way that they become a permanent part of the construction. And so if you want to change it, you sort of have to deal with them too. It's not a matter of the American system. I can return to the original stair somehow. You can't really ever return to the original stair without, you'd have to rebuild it from scratch.
I think that's true of every layered situation I showed you, like the copper roof at Castelvecchio. That's not real. It's a real copper roof, but it's not what's underneath the tile. And again, these are narratives. Scarpa was an architecture of surface, and I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism, but it was about what you see. And you can tell from his drawings, he's not that interested in what you can't see. It's usually hidden.
Well, I think, that it's also the nature of Venetian construction, because a lot of the layers are necessary to allow air to go behind the front layer to evacuate the moisture that naturally rises. All Venetian buildings are made of masonry and also concrete, for that matter. They basically just wick the water up the walls. And it's not something you can control, but you have to make sure that it doesn't get to the more refined material, so that he pulls the surface forward, but of course he has fun with it, but he does have to actually let the air go in. So there's also a necessity for this. That includes also the cladding around the existing columns that you pointed to in the walls in the Olivetti shop. The other thing I wanted to talk about though, which I think somehow is a little bit of a point of distinction, though I have to say my knowledge of Fehn's work is not as deep, or I haven't spent as much time in Norway as I have in Venice. And I think that there's something about the sensitivity to light. I mean, you mentioned the Rothko colors. In fact, he actually told his plaster person to refer to a book of Rothko. He pointed to the pages he wanted them to match. Yeah, he actually was quite, and that was particularly true in the bank, but I believe it was also true in the earlier projects, but for sure in the bank. I don't think that's true in Palermo. I mean, I'm not sure that he's made that connection, but he actually literally was using a Rothko catalog as a kind of color template for this fellow. I'm trying to remember his name, the fellow who did all his colored plaster work. But in the Palazzo Abatellis, which I had the pleasure of spending an entire weekend not so long ago, I had it all to myself. It's the pieces are framed, and you see them, as you said, against this strange notion of a kind of distant background, particularly some of the sculptures. But also they are positioned so that they have the perfect light when you first see them, and then you move around and see them from other aspects. But you also become aware that even though the stands are very symmetrical, the figures are kind of leaning forward, and almost every one you showed, you could see that the heads were as if they're moving towards you to interact with you. And of course they're set exactly at the right level for that to come across quite clearly. It almost to the point where some of them feel as if they're a little bit unstable structurally because the piece is so far forward on the stand. It's not at all, of course it's obviously properly secured, but he's giving it like your neck, when you put your head forward, when you're very interested in something, you sort of put your head forward. But the way in which he uses the light, and then after you've first seen it in the natural light of the window, then you turn and you get these other views, which perhaps are less dependent on the light, and you sort of see it from the different directions, as you mentioned. But that is, I think that's something that's particularly Venetian, also because of the light coming off the water and the sort of reflectivity and the sort of the mosaics, the reflectivity of the mosaics, these sorts of things. So I don't know if that was a question, but it's just a series of.
Well, I think that is certainly what I have heard about Scarpa's placement. It was intuitive, and he didn't necessarily. I think he did talk to the director about that particular statue whose back is to you as you enter.
Yes. In fact, there's a film of him describing why he did that, because there's a detail on the back that he actually thought no one would see if they just look at the front. No, I mean, it's true. You look at the front, you say hello to the sculptor, you walk by. So he actually turned it around. So the first thing you see is this incredible kind of draped piece. There's actually it's a good film of him explaining why, because everyone was saying, this is a very strange way. The guy has his back to you. You're kind of looking at it, which, as you say, is not usually it's not usually the sort of most designed portion, because they're facing you in the church or wherever they're originally positioned. I do see a question. I see one question, and I'm going to read it to you. It's from your former student, Ty Lee, who was in Italian class. I always feel Scarpa and Fehn have brought this sense of the landscape idea to architecture. Maybe it is about the sequence of experience. One goes up and down in the interiors of their works. It feels like a landscape idea without plants, as you could feel the terrain at work. Certainly that's true in the ramps, especially with Scarpa. Are there any elaborations on such gestures, is his question.
Well, I don't know if this is the answer, but it's something, particularly when you get to the subject of ramps, is Sven had a strange friendship with John Hayda. They got to know each other when Fehn was teaching in the US. And Hayda had done this series of wall houses which, you know, he really celebrated the idea of this wall. And a lot of Fehn's buildings involve a wall and a ramp. He was boxed in with the Hamar Museum, but the typical Fehn building is along the Glacier Museum or the Alkens Museum, or these long, often ramped structures. And there's no, I mean, he, you know, Sterling was on the ramp lumber, but I think Fehn used them in very different ways. There were ways of negotiating topography. And Fehn was really fascinated with this idea of, again, this completely useless ramp at the Hamar Museum. It just takes you up in the air so you can look down on where you've been. So I don't know. I think most, it's interesting. I don't know that Fehn worked with landscape art. He must have worked with landscape architects. If you look at things like the Glacier Museum, it's just sitting there. You know, it's not like the typical American building. It has an avenue of trees that lead up to it. So that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, I mean, you can use landscape in a lot of terms, but in terms of organic materials, I go back to what I said. He was obsessed with excavation, and that was his engagement with the land, I think, conceptually.
Yeah, and I think Scarpa, you know, is the layers you mentioned. He's very interested in vertical layers, which is true in terms of the sort of way the facades work. But if you look at the garden of the Castelvecchio, is the most incredibly crafted piece, and the entry ramp has a very, very slight tilt, which starts below the water level and ends above the water level. So the water, this little pool, is the only thing that's kind of helping you understand that you're making an ever so slight movement upwards. And then, of course, there's all these artifacts that have become sort of imprinted into the landscape somehow as part of that. But I think all his buildings, of course, are always playing with the idea that perhaps they'll be flooded tomorrow. And of course, in the Corriere Stampaglia, it is flooded, but it's not going to flood in Verona. But Verona still has these same kinds of details of suggestions of trenches and such around the edge to sort of separate the floor from the wall and allow the passage of water. And even to Pisagno, which is practically up in the mountains, you still get some of the same details, which are quite interesting. But I think, so I do agree that Scarpa is unusually sensitive about the vertical dimension, but I do also think that the horizontal planes, the sense of lamination, that if you think about the little sculpture garden that he did in the 50s, that was sort of buried in the middle of the Italian pavilion at the Biennale. You know, I started counting the planes from the roof plane down to the lowest, deepest pool. And I sort of, as soon as I got past 12 or 15, I quit trying to count, because there's so many horizontal layers that is constructed out of, and you're sort of hung somewhere in the middle. You're not at the top, you're not at the bottom. And the pools, you know, vary from about 2 inches down to either 3 or 4 feet, or anyway, darkness, so you can't see to the bottom. And of course, it sort of says something about the sort of you always have a little bit of an unhappy or unprepared aspect in terms of the water in Venice, at least until now, when they've got this dam that's usually supposed to work and apparently hasn't worked. But anyway, in days past, when you were there, you never knew when you'd have to stop and go home, because suddenly the water starts rising and you lose your ground plane, which of course is, if someone lives in Venice, is such an incredibly common experience. Tourists find it a sort of a pain, but the locals would have to live with it, or they can't live there. So,
hey, Robert, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was coming over to that one. I see a question from Marjorie Brownstein. This is her question. Having worked with EHDD on exhibits, which she says are more animal than mineral, how does ultimately this relate to architecture other than as an archaeological construct?
Well, I'd say hello to Marge, who was a classmate of mine.
Aha. All right.
And, you know, these museums are very different. I'm not sure, actually, I get what she's getting at. European museums are just very different, or at least they were in the 60s than American ones. And I think this situation where Scarpa would work with the director, and again, conditions that would be unthinkable today, incredible control over things. But again, Fehn's work is far more varied. I mean, he did a glacier museum, he did a museum for a cartoonist. You know, he did a lot more, and those buildings vary greatly. Scarpa's, he worked for the Biennale, which was contemporary writers, and he worked for this particular art world, which was this repurposing or removing religious art, which is a very limited field. Someone like Albini, who did a lot of work between, say, the commercial, showrooms and trade fairs and art as well. You can see an interaction between the way he displays typewriters and the way he displays art. You don't see that in Scarpa because I think he's rather narrow in the kind of commissions he got. But great to talk to you, Marge.
Unmute. The early part of your talk, I think actually, when you talked about the sort of where this idea of the frame and the unframe came from, I think that was actually quite interesting, because not all of that actually, I think, bears directly upon that, upon this subject of today, but I think it does remind you that, there's certain things we take for granted about the way things are presented. And I think that it's one of the reasons that when people go into Scarpa Museum who are used to maybe what you would say is a more normal museum, it's a bit shocking, because you're actually put into a really familiar, almost intimate relationship with the pieces. And it can be quite disturbing in some cases, because also, frankly, you look really closely at them and then you start seeing there's some very strange things in these paintings, and things, there's some strange things going on in these scenes. But because he puts that right there, as you said, very intimately, as if they're another individual, that you're being able to have a conversation with, you look at them in a very different way. You look at once maybe less sort of academically, because you sort of somehow aren't dealing with it as a kind of academic thing, but also you're looking much more carefully, because I think people spot things, and I do think he's also trying occasionally to reposition, like this thing about the altar pieces. I thought that was very interesting, because several of the images you showed, besides the one at the Castelvecchio, also had pieces organized in that way, the exhibit in the Biennale. And I think also the one that he did in Palermo before he was given the commission for the Palermo, for the Apitalis. He organized a series of pieces to kind of reconstitute altarpiece without the altar, without the church. So, which frankly is, which is the difference, to see the Mona Lisa, which was not painted to be seen in the Louvre, but to be seen in somebody's house, or is it, we're kind of caught between these two worlds, because I guess some of us would prefer that the paintings were back in the churches, but frankly, some of the churches they're not able to take care of these paintings. It's basically, you're consigning the painting to rot with the church, because it's only in the museum that they get preserved. So I think it's a really interesting subject that we're still coming back around to it. I think some museums like the Kimball are very much enjoyed, because the scale of the building somehow matched at least the original art that was part of the collection there. There was a kind of intimacy there that maybe it's not quite Scarpa, because Kahn wasn't really designing the installations, but it allows the curator to create that kind of intimacy between you and the piece, that Scarpa, because when he designed museums, he would sit with these paintings, he would sit in the room with them and just look, and he'd make all these drawings about what he was seeing, and then trying to talk about what would happen if it was a little higher or a little lower, or, and you see these photos of him just sitting there, staring at these paintings for hours, which then appear in his drawings very accurately, sort of redone as he's drawing how he wants to sort of put them into the place. So
it's a slightly different preservation issue, but I think one of the things that, it's been a while since I've been to Italy, but the last time I was in the Corini, Mario Botta had done this big renovation, and he didn't really disturb the Scarpa part, but now you go through it backwards. I mean, they don't use the Scarpa entry anymore. And I understand all the reasoning behind it, but it's just, it's like, you know, watching a movie and rewind.
No, it's true. I mean, but the fact is that the success of the building in terms of the popularity, it's completely overrun with architects all the time, and that little bridge would just never survive.
Oh yeah, that's the problem of
very. You know, it was just a sort of. I mean, you know, the building. The reason to go through that stair is to get to that other stair, so you can go up to the library, because it's actually one of the best scholarly libraries, and all the university students use it. But then the Corini Stampaglia expanded now they have a museum on top, and they have a museum, also another museum expanded to the next. So there are two people. One was a Scarpa pupil, and the other was Botta have made these rather, I don't know, not particularly well-resolved additions, because there's also an auditorium in there by Botta and others. But it is something, when I go, I just tell the students to close their eyes until we get to the bridge.
That's great.
I mean,
dangerous, but
inside of the bridge, you know, and then you can open your eyes and now you can see where you are. And because I really think it's important to get, it's a beautiful, delicate entry sequence. And now you're literally coming through what was the sort of end room that would just be used sort of as an overflow piece for exhibits and that sort of thing. Okay. Here's a big one. David Morganson. Is this another classmate? No. Oh, sorry.
I don't think so.
Okay. Fehn often said that the constructed thought was related to death. Could one interpret some of his design moves in terms of lifting one from and excavating into the earth to be part of this semi-religious narrative that positions the human experience between the darkness of the underworld to the etherealness of the sky, maybe similar to Boulet's cenotaph? In some way that he intentionally, in the same way, excuse me, that he intentionally positioned the gargoyles outside the concrete rooms at Hamar and the saints inside, and where they have the light. It's a very good question.
Well, interesting thought behind the question.
Yeah.
I think in my theory course at Arkansas, I just gave a lecture on sacred space, which you can't avoid the question of archetypes, and those are two classic ones. That the earth is three-tiered. You know, that there's it's in Greek or Islam or anything else. This idea that there's multiple strata to the world, which is the same ones that Fehn said. There's underground, there's on the ground, and there's the sky, which is in Italian is the same word as heaven. But and you know. The thought Fehn does, he can be very frustrating because he's trying so hard to be poetic, and I would really be just, well, tell me why you made that metal connector on the bottom of that wood building so big. That's the kind of thing I wish he'd tell me. And he's talking about death and the sky and all this stuff. And frankly, a lot of times, I'm really not sure what he was getting about. But he's right. He did have this with the horizon. He's constantly talking about the horizon. And of course, he lives in Norway, the sun.
I think that they have very different worldviews, because Scarpa talks a lot about being he talks about being a man of Byzantium who came to Venice by way of Greece. And that's what he wanted to be written on his tombstone, which unfortunately was not. But he really, and that comes to some degree from a poem by Eugenio Montale, which talks about the influence of Byzantine culture on that part of Italy. And but I think that Scarpa somehow is reading through those layers, whereas Fehn, you know, I always find Fehn actually maybe more sympathetic to Kahn, because he has that sort of worldview. You know, I mean, it's an interesting Norwegian architect that designs the anti-Palladio house, and he sits there and makes a drawing that shows him on one side of the world and the Villa Rotunda on the other side of the world. And there's a line that goes between the Villa Rotunda and his part of the world. And he's trying to, so he says, if I'm going to build a house, it cannot be the Palladian villa. It has to be the anti-Palladian villa, which means that the corners are glass and the centers are blocked. And that's exactly what he did, the Norrköping house, which is a really, really beautiful house. But I don't really see Scarpa engaging in that kind of dialogue, really. I think Scarpa felt he was in a kind of center. It may be an ancient center, maybe everybody's forgotten it now, Venice, but somehow it was a kind of center of the world. And with Fehn, you get a very strong sense of the distance. I mean, he's constantly talking about it, and it even kind of comes into the way he makes his little drawings.
Well,
By the way, Mr. Morgenstein is a UVA graduate, so I'm gonna test your memory here.
when it's all over, come see me. It's, Fehn was of a generation of the Team 10 group, and he knew Van Eyck, and he was very, like them, he was very taken with North Africa. And it was a lot like when I was at WashU, there were certain, if you went to Italy, you'd go to the hill towns. The idea was the vernacular architecture was the pure architecture. Palladium, God forbid you should go to But I think Fehn shared that. I think, he made this trip, I think, to Morocco when he was a young student, and he talked about how that, much like Corbusier, he found it as a kind of revelation. So, and again, he actually talked about Palladio. He wrote this imaginary dialogue between Palladio and Corbusier, which, frankly, I have no idea what he's getting at. But again, it's part of his, the poet,
Yeah. Well, I think it's part of his positioning himself as someone on the edge, speaking to the center. So I have this should probably be the final question, because I think we've gone on a good while here. And so John Ellis asks, can you make any connection between these two architects and Plečnik, the great Slovenian architect? So Josip Plečnik. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, Scarpa, most Italians are not fond of the Austrians for historical reasons.
Slovenians in this case, but
But Scarpa, I can't. You just quoted him. He said he didn't want to go north of the Alps, but he made the exception of Vienna. And it's clear that he liked Hoffman and Ulrich and the kind of the mosaic-like work of that group. And of course, that's where Plečnik began as part of the Wagner school, and then went to do what he did in what's now, can't think of the town.
Slovenia, Ljubljana.
Yes. Yeah, Ljubljana.
Yeah, but he has the Prague castle also. But yeah, he's very much a part of the Venetian culture, turn of the century culture.
But again, that's the thing about Scarpa, is he told you little bits, and you look at it and say, well, obviously all this layering, that's Otto Wagner, that's Vienna, it's not just Venice, but it can be, again, you can only wonder what the connections.
Yeah. Well, I think he was quite explicit about Hoffman.
Yeah.
Didn't talk as much about Wagner, though. Of course, Wagner was kind of the godfather of that school. But the whole idea of cladding, of course, as a theory. But I think he was much more interested in, the Hoffman of the palace and such things. But of course, I will mention that Scarpa designed a house in Zurich. So I suppose there's certain places that are north of the Alps that are okay, including a certain street in Zurich where he did a house. So. But that was only for a woman who was originally from Venice, is Mazzieri's wife or widow. Yeah, so he did a house for her once she left Venice and moved to Zurich. Okay, I think we've exhausted many subjects, but Ed, thank you very much for a fantastic lecture.
I've enjoyed it.
We touched a lot of bases here, I have to say, really terrific. And again, for those of you that have questions or have questions about some of the things that were mentioned in the lecture, you will be able to look at a recording of it. All these are available a few weeks, maybe 2 weeks after the actual event. It'll show up on the same listing where you found the link to attend tonight, and you'll be able to have a look at the recording, which just gets edited, but it should include all the questions and everything else as well. So anyway, thank you all. And
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Ed, I'm looking forward to seeing you in real time, real place. Gotta happen soon. All right.
Okay. Thank you all.
See you, man. Bye.